Hello, everyone, and hopefully you're getting audio this time. Maybe we finally figured this out after God knows how long.
The fourth one?
Fourth one. This is number four of our ongoing
Well, you know what they
exploration.
say. Well, you know what they say, fourth time's the charm.
Is that a thing we said? Because I don't.
Yes, this is the thing I said just now.
It is an ancient aphorism that was just coined just now.
Yes.
Hooray! It was audio. Excellent. So this is Lunch and Crunch. I am Eddy Webb, one of the in-house developers here at Onyx Path, and my lovely colleague Danielle.
Hi, I'm Danielle Lauzon. Man, I don't even know my own last name.
Right?
Uh,
It's so hard.
it's confusing sometimes. Danielle Lauzon, I am not an in-house developer, but I do a lot of junk for Onyx Path. And so
Clearly not marketing, however. You know, a lot of junk.
I do a lot of junk for Onyx Path. And so here I am talking to Eddy.
Well, before we dive into it, of course, obviously the most important question that we're going to talk about the entire hour is what are you having for lunch today?
So for today, I am having an adult Lunchable. Literally, it's just cheese and crackers and
Ooh,
oh my god, crackers and sausage. So just literally an adult Lunchable.
nice.
Not even a charcuterie board. Like I couldn't even call it that. It's
We're not going to
literally like
justify it.
yeah, like a sausage, some cheddar cheese, and some Ritz crackers. Like that. It's as basic as you can get.
That works. And what are you drinking?
So today my tea is so I bought some of the teas from D&T that you talked about.
Oh, nice.
And I got a tea called Tavern Brawl
Ooh,
that is a chocolate coconut black tea.
interesting.
It is just like it just has the hints of those flavors.
Mm-hmm.
Um and with a little bit of cream, it's like this really nice, almost like a dessert tea.
Oh, wow.
Um it's not super sweet or anything. It's just got the hints of chocolate and the hints of coconut
Mm-hmm.
in its like black tea form. And I have been I'm really enthralled by it and I love it a lot. It's just the strangest combination of flavors. I was like, that sounds like it might be interesting. And so I got it and it's fantastic. So if you want to give it a try, I definitely suggest it. Um, I also got whatever the one you had was,
The
the Earl
Underdark and Chilled.
Grey. Yeah, the Underdark and Chill is also very good. So,
Excellent. And also, apparently, Dixie is here eating lunch. So, Dixie, please tell us in
oh,
chat what you're eating because we want to
oh
share.
yes, please.
While we're waiting for that, I have the remains of a bagel with turkey and cheese. I
Mm,
was
yum.
hungry setting up, so I started early. Apologies. And then
That's fair.
for tea, I think I had this earlier, but it's great tea, so I'm having it again. Casting Whimsy 11sies, which is a great Irish breakfast tea of
Ooh.
Assam and China. Chinese black tea. So it's nice because I mean it's I generally drink like my day to day tea is berries tea, which is also an Irish breakfast tea. And this is nice because it's a little smoother. It doesn't require as much sugar, so it's got a little bit kind of inherent sweetness, and it's a decent amount of caffeine, so it's great for a breakfast tea. And Dixie's eating a roast beef and salami sandwich on a bagel with cream and cheese and onion, and the bagel is sourdough. So excellent. We are now up to date on Onyx Path food. Thank
I
you all
mean,
for
we could ask.
watching.
Great show.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Yes, this is what we eat. That's it. That's all we talk about in the show. What we're eating.
It's lunch and lunch. Actually, that's the name of the show.
It's
It's just
lunch. Yes, lunch and the crunch is my cracker.
right into the microphone. No. Today, as always, we're going to talk about kind of an aspect of rules design. And today, we kind of want to talk about implicit versus explicit rules. mainly because I think it is a topic that a lot of people who are not game designers don't entirely recognize. And there's occasional conversations I see online where they bits and pieces towards that kind of concept, but don't really kind of embrace it. So I thought maybe we'd start with talking about what those are specifically. So I don't know if you, Daniel, have any initial thoughts about like what implicit versus explicit rules are. Or I can actually go
First,
while
you
you're
asked the
chewing.
moment I put a cracker in
I
my
know.
mouth.
I'm so good at this.
You're like a waiter. So when we talk about implicit rules, it is kind of like, I want to say like, oh, I want to use the word to describe the rules. So let me try to give a bit of a definition. So implicit is something that is implied by the app, but it's not described fully. So, you see a lot of memes on there where it's like, oh, the existence of X implies the existence of Y,
Right.
right? And
For example,
the
the existence of dry Bowser in Mario implies the existence of moist Bowser.
so wet, yes, moist Bowser, yes, exactly. Um, or the there's lots of them,
Right.
right? And the implicit rules are, they're not they're not put there in text, but they're implied by the existence of the surrounding text. And explicit rules are completely called out in, this is what you do, this is how this works. So implicit rules are often rules that aren't stated as explicitly because they're at least believed to be common sense, or in sometimes specifically left up to interpretation for the reader to determine how exactly this rule is going to work.
Right. The example I often give is the movie Air Bud. And I want to preface this example by saying I've actually never seen the movie Air Bud. I have seen the movie poster and read the plot on Wikipedia. But in my mind, there is some scene that breaks down something like this. It is the Air Bud is brought onto the basketball court. The referee says something along the lines of like, "Dog can't play basketball. Get that dog out of here." And then the human with Air Bud says, "There's nothing in the rulebook that says a dog can't play basketball," and the rulebook is hastily referenced. Turns out there is no explicit rule saying dogs can't play basketball, and therefore he's allowed to play basketball. But we all recognize that when we're making a game or a sport in this case, that is assumed there are certain assumptions like the players are all human. The players are all going to take their turns in a reasonable amount of time. The players are all, speaking a commonly understood language. Things like that don't need to be explicit, but that does not invalidate their status as a rule. So I'm sorry, no, dogs cannot in fact play basketball.
Right. At least, not in official capacity.
Not professionally, no. Amateur basketball, yeah. I mean, I can't really argue on that point. But I mean, professionally, no, dogs cannot play basketball.
Even... Right. So I have another example of how explicit rules can invalidate implicit rules. Mm-hmm. And I think Neil told me about this example, and I don't know where he got it from, but he called it the air breathing mermaid example, which is that if you say you have mermaids and you're coming up with special powers for mermaids, and one of the special powers you give them is the ability to breathe air. Well, in every story about a mermaid, they come up out of the water and they sing or they talk or they whatever, and it's implied that mermaids could breathe air. But the moment I make an explicit rule that says you need this rule to breathe air, now without that rule, we can't breathe air. Mm-hmm. And so it is implied normally that mermaids can breathe underwater, they can breathe air. But when you make an explicit rule that says, okay, well, without this rule, you can't do this thing, you suddenly start invalidating some implicit rules. Some assumptions that you would make of, well, if I have this skill or ability, I should be able to do X, Y, Z. But if you make specific rules that say, well, you need this, like, I will just say a word, and this is just an example. I'm not really saying anything about this game, but if I make a charm that
Right.
says you need this charm to be able to do this thing, now suddenly I can't do that thing without that charm in a game that uses charms. I don't know what game that would be.
Right. And the reverse is true, I think. Sometimes if a rule is not explicitly stated, there's the kind of why can't you do that? But there
Yep.
are often either kind of cultural norms or the fiction of the game itself implies you shouldn't do that. And
Right.
that leads to some conflicts. The common example I think of in this is like the Zerg Rush in why I just blanked on the name of the video game. The
Warcraft?
No, not Warcraft.
Starcraft.
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 Thank you.
One of the crafty games.
One of those games. But basically the idea is that one person's not going to do a deep dive into Starcraft. Thank you. One of the into one unit, just make a whole bunch of a cheap unit and then flood the field with that, because the game implies there's a lot of different options and different ways you spend it. So you can buy all these different things and try to maximize it and synergize them together. It doesn't expect you to just go deep into the cheapest possible unit and turn them into throwaway troops. And yet, these Zerg rushes was a fairly common tactic in StarCraft, just making super cheap Zergs and then flooding your opponent with them until they eventually just die. Similarly, we talk a bit about white room balance in tabletop role-playing game design. And what that is a lot of the examples of combat imply two combatants who are in a completely featureless room fighting each other until one of them falls over dead. And so there's often some kind of discussion around things like, well, then this game is imbalanced because, like, a werewolf and a vampire in a white room, werewolf will always win, so there's kind of a balance there. But oftentimes, a tabletop role-playing game's combat's not happening in a white room, it's happening in an environment. And whether the environment has a mechanical effect, there are certainly implicit effects. Having a brawl on a street is going to, in a lot of cases, shape player actions, as opposed to a brawl happening in an empty warehouse, or a brawl happening in an apartment building, or a brawl happening, in a wedding reception or whatever.
Right. And I think that, you end up with some, I hate white room balance discussions, honestly.
Oh, yeah, so do I.
Because of that, because it removes all the context from everything, and also it assumes that, like, oh man, if my statted out werewolf character was fighting my statted out vampire character, then my werewolf character would win. But also, like, the likelihood that those two characters would interact into a way that they would fight is actually pretty slim.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the need to balance between them is kind of a moot point also.
Right, but that's one of the things that I think novice designers sometimes run into, is because they feel like they have to articulate every single rule. And sometimes that is true, particularly if something, like you said with the water breathing mermaids example, sometimes it's I want to make sure a specific component of this game world or this game experience is different than expected. So therefore, we do need to articulate, yeah, what you think this is not actually, the thing. But I am going to digress into a rant I've had before. I'm having it again now. I'll probably have it in future. This is why I dislike the rules as written versus rules as intended distinction, because it implies that the author of the rules' intention is more important than the interpretation of the rules, which is bunk. What's really being said is rules as written are explicit rules and rules intended are implicit rules. So use those terms.
I mean, use implicit versus explicit. Also, rules as intended is so weird to me, because, like, half the time if I have written a rule, and unless I have written it poorly to where I made a mistake in writing it,
Right.
what is written there is what I intended.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have written it down.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have written it down. And also, half the time, if I look at a rule, I won't know, like, if I had some secret intention or had some implicit intention that isn't kind of obvious from the written rule, I will not remember what I was intending. That is, like, I sleep and then I forget half the things that I've done the day before.
Oh, yeah.
So,
and also, like, the cycle of a tabletop role-playing game, the time you write it down to the time of publication might be a year or two.
yeah. And it's frustrating whenever I see people talking about, well, that's not what was intended, or, well, it's clear that this is what was intended. And I'm like, well, I mean, if it's clear that this is what is intended, then, like, that's an implicit rule.
Right.
Then, like, then it's clear. I'm not sure what the argument is. But people sure do like to get into a thing and be really.
Well, I mean, again, I'm moving into artistic territory for a moment, but as an artist, I very firmly believe in the death of the author as a rhetorical concept, right? What the author intended ultimately does not matter. It matters how the work is received, and that is going to be unique to each individual.
Yeah, and Adric brings up a good point, which is that sometimes it's unclear. And that is a case of, like I said, if I wrote it poorly or in a way that, like, I made a mistake, then, like, yeah, errata or clarification to this is what is supposed to be written there,
Right.
or this is what should be written there, is fine to ask for. But sometimes I see these arguments not over something that is particularly confusing or could be taken in. What is that?
Oh, this is my tea cozy. It is President Higgins of Ireland.
Oh my God.
He is an amazing human being, but my wife, Michelle, found someone on Etsy who makes tea cozies, and they made one of President Higgins, so now we have that.
I love him.
He is wonderful.
Amazing.
I'm sorry, what were you saying? President Higgins.
I don't even know. President Higgins distracted us both.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I was saying.
Well, then,
Gone.
one of the things that kind of relates to all of this is, as you mentioned earlier, some of these rules are common sense. Yeah. And sometimes we get so used to a certain set of implicit rules, often subconsciously, that we don't think about the implications of it until things change. And right now, I'm primarily thinking of VTT. As we've been moving more heavily into VTT, I have been finding some rules that I wrote don't quite make sense. I mean, they make sense, but there's a need for some explicit rules, particularly when I wrote Fetch Quest, which is a card game. There is a lot of play move to the left, play move to the right, which is a completely meaningless concept. And the implicit rule is you will be sitting around a table, which will allow you to physically examine each other and recognize who is on your left or right, respectively, and be able to rotate turns accordingly. That doesn't make sense. So I had to rewrite the rules and basically say it goes alphabetical by the name of the character. So that way it's something else that people can look at and go, okay, well, I could see, Yosha is probably going to be at the end of the turn. But it did change the strategy of the game because it went from theoretically any character could start and any character could end to Yosha's generally going to be the last character to go in a turn. And for Fetch Quest, it doesn't matter too much, but there is an interesting strategy of it ended up being an interesting case because the spellcaster goes last, and that's not a bad place for the spellcaster to be in the turn order from a strategic standpoint. So ultimately, I was like, it does change this, but it didn't bother me, so I kind of left it. But it's a different implicit rule. Like, I don't spell that out anywhere, but it's like, oh, well, if you go by this thing, Yosha's going to be the last person to go. But we were talking about clarifying unclear rules.
Yeah. Right, which is a thing that like we as designers, we make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes.
Hmm.
And, we may need to clarify an unclear rule, but sometimes, I understand wanting an authority to settle an argument at the table.
Hmm.
But sometimes I don't want to be the one to settle your arguments at the table.
Right.
Because I have been on the receiving end of oh, well, the designer settled this rule for me
Oh,
because
I hate that. Hmm.
I went to the forums and I asked, and now I'm the one who's right and you're wrong at the table. And I have been subjected to that in the past.
Particularly
And
LARP.
yes, particularly in LARP. But in other places as well.
Hmm.
And, even recently, I have been told, while I've been having a rules discussion of like, hey, this is how I think this rule should work, right? I'm not trying to say this is exactly what the rule says, but this is how I think it should work. And somebody gives me pushback and says, well, I know the designer. And I'm like, I don't care. It's unclear. And I think that, it depends on the spirit of it, right? If somebody is literally like, I'm confused and I don't know how this works, could you please explain it? I will be happy to explain a rule that somebody's just confused about or unclear about, or,
Sure.
my table tried to figure it out and we're not sure what to do. Like, happily clarify those rules. Me and my friend are in an argument about which way this works. We both have an opinion on it. Um, Unless you're like specifically asking me to weigh in, I don't like to weigh into those kind of discussions just because you're both right unless one
Right.
of you is just clearly wrong.
Hmm.
If it was confusing enough to where you could both be right, like, just, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you there. Um, Other than to say you could both be right. So
I mean,
I don't know. I don't like settling arguments.
no, I'm with you on that. I think if we reframe these arguments into the implicit versus explicit divide, though, there is an interesting middle ground that I frankly have not seen, but I know I would be comfortable wading in on, which is are there any implicit rules we are violating by making this change? This is more about house rules, right? It's like we
Right?
know the
Yeah.
rules, we know the rule, the explicit rule is blah. We want to change X to Y. Are there
Right.
any implicit rules that, because we're not designers, we're not thinking through that this will change? But that's not rules as written, rules as intended. That is specifically, we want to make a change. We're not the designers, so we don't know if there's other parts of the system engine that causes problems for. And I usually am happy to wade into those conversations because, like, okay, if you do change this, here's what I anticipate could possibly result from that. And whether that's good or bad is irrelevant to me, but I'm happy to kind of have those discussions, partially because you and I are both just love talking design. So it's like, yeah,
Right.
that's fun for us. It's like, yeah, what if you did this, then this could happen, blah, 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 blah. But that's not, the rules are unclear. That's not rules as intended. That is specifically, I don't understand, I don't have the whole engine planned out. I don't understand how these things connect necessarily because there's
Yeah.
sometimes implicit threads between systems.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some people who are like, "Hey, this is unclear," and then other people say, "Well, this is how I've been house ruling this to solve this problem." And I like seeing that
Yeah.
actually because I like seeing people who, instead of saying like, "Oh, well, you're wrong," or being argumentative, just saying like, "I made a house rule that I feel like solves the question."
Hmm.
And sharing, that shows some engagement from the community. It shows some engagement from people, and I like that fans are thinking about design.
Hmm.
Sometimes I think that fans spend a lot of time talking about lore, especially in lore heavy games.
Right.
Um, and there's a lot of lore discussions, and there's a lot to argue about with lore, or, discussion to have about lore, which is just fine. But usually the mechanical discussions I see aren't people thinking about the design aspects of the game so much as just, how do I cheese my character, or how do I get to do the thing I really want to do, or this rule is unclear, or can we fix it? But they're not thinking like, I want to make a house rule because I feel like there's not a rule that's doing the thing I really want to do. And maybe it's an implied rule and maybe it's not. But I don't see as much, like, I guess, hacking and homebrewing. And maybe it's just the spaces I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know it's out there. I know people are doing it. I just don't see it as much. And I don't see discussions on it as much as I see some of the other discussions.
No, the places I've seen it have been usually either direct to me or usually in the frame of, I want to do a community content thing, and so how do I make this community content thing work the way I think it should work? Which is in the same wheelhouse as house rules. And I can see, because, for example, I had someone approach me and was like, hey, so I want to make bats playable in Pugmire. It was not Dixie, but I'm sure Dixie would appreciate this. And they said, I'm going to use kind of the dog rules, but I'm going to give them access to the birds and hacks that allow them to fly or not. And I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. I don't see how that would break anything. Similarly, people like, I want to give, this species are the ones that have these callings, but I want to give the callings to their species. Does it break anything? And again, I'm like, I designed them to be portable, but I don't necessarily make that available because it adds too much complexity and there's too much of it. So like I just say, there's going to be a handful of powers or rules exceptions that may come up. You may have to house rule on the fly because they weren't designed that way. Like, for example, and here's an implicit rule that I never talk about. With Pugmire, a lot of the powers are designed to help the group. They don't help you as much, but they help other. I give you a die, and you go use that die this way, and you cast a spell, it buffs me, and blah. That is meant to kind of increase the group dynamic because it's kind of the point of playing a group of dogs. The cat powers are much more, I'm going to make myself amazing, and if you happen to be near me because I'm so amazing and you get a benefit, that's cool. But if you weren't there, it doesn't really matter to me either way.
No. Because I am fabulous.
Right, exactly. It's like, by your sheer proximity to how amazing I am, you get benefit. So you should be near me as much as possible because I'm amazing. And there's no reason why you can't swap those powers between the group, but it does change the tone of those respective games. So that's why it's usually like, if you want to do it, yeah, but the powers as written aren't quite designed to give the exact same experience. So you're intentionally moving into an area where it's not going to quite work. Dixie mentions mixing bird and mouse rules for bats, and actually I think it's pretty valid. The mouse rules are not out except to Kickstarter backers for Squeaks in the Deep, but it's the same thing. Like, mice were written for a certain kind of experience. If you put wings on it, yeah, you get pretty close to a bat. But just because, I think more to the point, just because a rule is not written down does not mean that there wasn't designer intent there. And sometimes this goes into the space, which I'll leave to you because I know you have a thought about this, but just because there are a lot of rules written down doesn't make a rule system complicated. Just because there are very few rules doesn't make a rules game system easy.
Yeah. So I do have a lot of thoughts about that. And it's the concept of it really the implied rules versus explicit rules, and how rules work and what a rule is versus a mechanic versus a setting piece or whatever. And everything that is how you play the game is a rule. So, when you're talking about turn order for fetch quest, determining turn order is a rule that you have written into the game at some point. Right. Whether it's an implied rule, play goes to the left, or the explicit rule of play goes in order of character alphabetical, right? That's a rule, even if it's not about rolling dice, even if it's not a random chance, it's a thing that you're going to do. It's a rule.
Right.
And things you can't do, even if they're not codified in rules, are rules to a certain degree. Like, if you don't have, here's an example, and I'm going to use Powered by the Apocalypse as my prime example of a rule system that is considered rules light, but actually has a lot of rules. They're not complicated, and they're not hard to follow or manage, but there are a lot of rules written into PBTA.
Yes.
So calling it rules light is actually a misnomer because every move written onto every playbook is a rule. And every playbook has, for every game of PBTA I've ever seen, has 4 to 5 of their own special moves, plus a 4 to 5 rule, moves that are general moves that everybody can take, plus the rules about, whether or not there's equipment, plus the rules about whether or not, XYZ can happen, plus all the rules for the GM and what they're doing. And there's a lot of rules written into PBTA, but they're not complicated rules, and they're not rules that are hard. But there's a steadfast rule, which is your character can take an action, and they don't need to roll for an action that they could just generally do.
Right.
But there are certain things that they can't do if there's not a move for it. So that rule is, in a lot of ways, the big implicit rule in PBTA is if there's not a move for it, you can't do it. Well, this doesn't say that, it masks. There's no move in masks for your character to make a convincing argument to an adult.
Right.
Or to anyone, really. Which means that you just can't. You're a teenager. You shouldn't be able to.
Right.
You shouldn't be able to reason with adults, or even each other, honestly. And so, the implied rule there is that if it's not written down as a move, you can't do it. It doesn't say you can do it, and so you can't. And there's a lot of games like that have a lot of rules. They're just not complicated. And, when I hear rules light, it's more like rules easy.
Right.
Or, light being that it's not complicated, not that there aren't a lot of them.
Right. Another example is a lot of rules light games are really, from a design perspective, most of your common actions can be done through the same core resolution system.
Right.
Whereas rules dense systems there are lots of subsystems that modify and tweak the core resolution systems in different distinct ways.
Right. And, I feel like the more complicated the system is, the more it hinges on implied rules to help the engine move, where a system that is considered rules light just sets out a specific list of explicit rules. And if it's not written down as a thing you can do, you're not doing it.
Right.
And I think that's also maybe makes those feel less complicated, because you're not trying to interpret a lot of implicit rules of what's going on, and everything is spelled out for you, which is really helpful in the sense that there's some decision paralysis that comes with choice or implied rules that can kind of stymie people's play in a more complicated system.
Right.
I'm not saying that more complicated systems are suddenly like bogged down in all these rules. Some are run really elegant. But it does have a sticking point that I feel like, the games that have a list of explicit rules and you can't really do anything else it's got the advantage of that simplicity in explicit.
Right, because there's always, or near always, something you can look up to answer your question. Right. Which, and it goes to the simple versus easy, complex versus hard distinction we talked about a couple episodes ago.
Right.
One of the best examples I know of implicit rules being made explicit, which makes the game both easier to play and also changes the experience, is the Illuminati card game. The Illuminati card game has explicit cheating rules. There are very specific ways on how to cheat in the game. And at first I was in love with these because I just love the idea of a rule that breaks the rules. This is how within the rules you're allowed to break the rules. But like Danielle said, it's still a rule, right? So you're not actually breaking the rules. Rather, this is how you violate the other listed rules of the game. And the cheating rules are pretty simple, which is that if you are caught, you have to undo what you did cheat. That's pretty much it. And also, you cannot disrupt the state of play. You can't flip a table over, or you can't shove cards around. Those are the only cheating rules. But but really saying is if you violate the rules in a specific way, this allows certain things to happen. And what's interesting about that is if you look at sports, this actually happens a lot in sports. Because then you can strategize around rules violations, right? Because they're not really rules violations. Fouls, for example, in basketball or football. Usually you can get X number of fouls before you're removed from the game. And so I'm not up on, I believe basketball, it's 3 minor fouls and 1 major foul, something like that. But what that really means is I could do 2 minor fouls with no effective consequence. And that's what happens.
Use them wisely.
Yes, particularly in soccer/European football, you see this a lot, where players will intentionally kick or tackle or otherwise basically try to injure other players. And as long as it's not seen as a major infraction, as long as it could be argued off as an accident or otherwise a minor infraction, if you can argue it down to a minor infraction, there's no effective penalty. You're off field for a few minutes, whatever. But then you actually get an interesting strategic advantage because it's yes, we lost a player for a small period amount of time, but another player may be effectively removed from the game. And that's a key player that can change an entire game. That's a strategy based around intentionally not following the rules. And how this applies to games like Storypath, for example, is that you can intentionally just ignore the rules to get a certain scene across. I've done this a couple times. On another podcast, we're talking about the 1 hour adventuring day, right? Which is you get up in the morning after your long rest, you have a big monster fight at 10 a.m., and then you immediately go into the long rest because you need to get all of your major powers back.
Right.
But if I were game mastering a game and I wanted someone to have a cool death scene, I'm going to sacrifice my character for a cool death scene, I would probably rule something. Okay, you get all of your long rest abilities back immediately. You can use them as much as you want to, but when the scene's over, you're dead. That is violating the rules. I'm intentionally violating the explicit rules of the game and the implicit rules of the game to get a very specific moment across. But the implicit rule in the tabletop role-playing game community is it is okay to do this with the caveat of it's fun for the game.
Right.
So a lot of times when we talk about it's your game, do what you want. What we're really invoking is the implicit rule of in tabletop role-playing games, it is okay to violate the explicit rules in the interest of making the game more enjoyable or the story more compelling based on what your player group has normalized as fun.
This is going to make me talk about the chaos game, isn't it?
It is.
So, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that rules matter.
Right.
But rules don't matter at all. And it's a truth. It's 2 truths that you have to hold together in your head, which is that the rules will tell you what the game is supposed to be about. The rules will tell you how to play the game. The rules will tell you what's important to the game. And the rules will tell you a lot of information about the play style of the game, the feeling that's supposed to be evoked from, at the table. And a well-designed game, when you're playing the game using all the rules as written, when you're all those rules, you get an experience, a play experience from that game. And then the other truth is that, but none of those rules actually matter. What matters is having fun with your friend. So if a rule is getting in the way of you having fun with friends, toss it out the window, nobody's going to care. And this is exemplified in a thought experiment that I had, which is that I bet I could run a game with a bunch of different characters from a bunch of different game systems and a bunch of different mechanics and still have it be fun, because balance doesn't really matter. What people can do doesn't really matter. How their mechanics work doesn't really matter. What matters is being able to craft a fun story and letting players feel like they're succeeding and winning and doing the thing they want to do. And so I ran a game here on the Onyx Path Twitch. I don't remember if it was during the Onyx Path Con or... Oh, no, it was during...
It was a charity stream. We did it like...
It was a charity stream. Yep. And I ran this game as a charity stream, and I had a bunch of different people play. Like, Eddy played a My Little Pony character. Dixie played a Sailor Moon character. We had Monica played her Exalted second edition character.
Yes. Very specific.
Yes. Kim played her Through the Breach character, and who else was in that
someone else
game?
played a Monster of the Week character, I think.
Yes. It was Erica Scorpion.
Right.
Was playing a Monster of the Week character. So we're talking PBTA, Through the Breach, Exalted Second Edition, Sailor Moon, My Little Pony. Like, none of those games are very similar at all. And they ended up in like a D&D world where they were talking to a guy in a tower who was an Ordo Dracul from Requiem.
I loved that. It was so good. He was so mad.
He was so mad. Like, what are all these people doing here? I'm trying to get home too. This is terrible. And it was nonsense. The whole thing was nonsense, and most of it was role play. But when people wanted to do a thing, I made them roll whatever their characters would need to roll to do that thing. And they did, and then I would give them results because their rules mattered to them and to what they were interested in. And it was very interesting because Eddy's My Little Pony character spent all of his time forging friendships and ensuring that people were friends, because that's what that game is about.
I got points for that.
He got points for that. And that's what his game was about, friendship. And so that character spent all of his time ensuring that everybody around him was a friend, being friends, forging new friendships, et cetera, et cetera. The Sailor Moon character was also a little bit about friendship, but also just the over-the-top anime kind of thing going on. And then the Exalted character was trying to get into fights, not necessarily with other characters, but was, looking for a thing to do.
Right.
An epic thing to do. And then there were some other characters, the Monster of the Week character was very like, oh, there are monsters here. I'm going to investigate everything. I want to know the deep lore behind everything. All of this is based on their mechanics.
Right.
And they were doing what their mechanics told them they should be doing, even in a place where none of that mattered at all. And it was really interesting to me to see, one, of course it worked because, I just let people do whatever they wanted to do. So that's, the game is made up and the rules don't matter. But also it was interesting to see people still playing into what their game rules would normally ask them to be doing. And, how hard-coded that is in an implicit way. Oh, thank you, Dixie. She posted the
video link.
The link to the video. So if people want to watch it, I don't know, it was a couple of hours long. It's very nonsense and very silly. So if you want to spend some time later and watch it, I would recommend it because it was a good time.
And I just want to break it real quick and say one of the things that I found interesting, and it was me being kind of a dick, but also I knew you could handle it, was the fact that the My Little Pony rule set I was using, Tales of Equestria, had an implicit rule because there's no rules for death. So by the it goes back to the water breathing mermaid thing, because there are no rules for dying, ergo characters don't die. And putting that into a situation where the implicit rules characters can die led to conflict. And I turned it into a role-playing opportunity.
Sure.
because what is death? I don't understand it. I've never experienced it before. Even though I have since learned that there are actually characters who do die in the My Little Pony universe. It's just the way the rules are written. That's all for only dramatic moments, right? Like, the character dies because it's narratively interesting to do so. But we rolled with it. I mean, and I was fully willing to accept that Danielle's like, okay, the rules don't matter here, so your character can die. If that's what happened, that would have happened. Great, I would have rolled with it. But it did lead to it leads to an interesting kind of case study, because if we weren't doing this in an intentionally silly way, if certain players come to the table with one set of implicit rules and a player comes to the table with a different set of implicit rules, that can lead to unintentional, unironic conflict.
Well, I mean, even the death thing, right? So if, a Storypath character is interacting with a D&D character, in Storypath, when you run out of health levels, you get taken out, but you don't die.
Right.
Except for in very specific Storypath games.
Mm-hmm.
But in D&D, if you get, there's all sorts of rules for dying.
Oh, yeah.
In D&D. So, your D&D character, if there's a party wipe, your D&D character's dead, and your Storypath character is unconscious until the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And wakes up and finds out his friend died, survivor's guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, unless there's another D&D character around to do some kind of resurrection spell, dead forever.
Right.
Because people who die in Storypath die forever.
Mm-hmm.
And you can die, and they understand that, those characters do understand death, but again, it's for dramatic moments. It's not written into the rules that your character is going to die if you run out of health.
Right.
And so you could end up with situations where that is not balanced at all. Like one character dying randomly and another character not is probably not fun gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
For the person whose character died to know that, well, if I was just playing a different system, my character wouldn't have died. So it's definitely, we were playing it for the fun of it, not for trying to play it straight, because playing it straight would have been far more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's especially for games like Storypath, for example, some people have asked, well, why do the rules change between They Came From the Sea, between Trinity, between Dystopia Rising and whatnot? And part of that is that we have to explicitly shape the rules to go a specific direction to get a certain experience out of that. And also simultaneously, we do not have the expected consumption model that someone who buys game A is going to also have bought games B, C, and D and need to know the differences between them. We're assuming that you bought game A, you're going to play game A, and that is the only game you may potentially have an experience with. So we don't have necessarily, well, this is different from blah, 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 and these reasons why. Yes, Ardrick, you're one of the case studies I'm thinking about, because you've talked about sometimes when you shift between Storypath games, you run into the kind of, whether the implicit rules here, because it's not spelled out. One that came up recently was how many rewrites you start with in They Came From the Sea, because most of the Storypath games start with I think it's number of players, start points of momentum. Yeah. They Came From the Sea doesn't really say anything, and so the assumption coming from the Storypath games is there needs to be a number here. Please tell me the number. This is a mistake. But in Matthew's case, he did not want to limit people on that front. So he's like, if you want to say number of players, that's fine. But in reality, if you start with 0 and you generate your rights through the course of the game, that also is a perfectly valid They Came From experience. Whereas in other Storypath games, you need that currency to get things going pretty early in the game, so you have to kind of prime the pump a little bit because that's how those games work. So enough has changed and They Came From that need for the extra points is no longer there, so there's no longer a need to enshrine that number. Those are all implicit assumptions in the design, and if you're going from one to the other, it seems like it's an error, but in fact, each game's like, okay, you don't need to necessarily have that number there.
Right.
So, I mean, and Matthew says come out and saying, it doesn't really matter to me which kind of, how many numbers you start with, because some groups are going to generate a whole bunch of rewrites by the way they play their game, and other groups aren't going to touch rewrites and also aren't going to really touch on the cinematics all that much. Right. So it depends on how you're kind of positioning it, and that becomes the way the game modulates itself. Whereas in straight Storypath, Scion, Trinity, what have you, it's all about failing forward. We want people to not fail, and so having a couple points to buffer them from that early on is the intention. Because it's a comedy game, they came from failing is wonderful. It's part of the fun of the game. So we want to kind of remove that buffer a little bit. But if people want that buffer, we want to put it back. So by not giving a specific number, people can dial that in how they see fit.
Right. And I, there's definitely some between the game lines, there's some differences. And again, each game is written to be self-contained for itself and for those rules to work within that game system. And so, one of the things that I'm going to talk about scale, but it just as an example, the scale number system in Scion is different from the scale number system in Trinity Continuum. And that's it, just the way it is. Mm-hmm. You're not supposed to be hitting Scion characters along with Trinity Continuum characters. Those are two completely different games.
Right.
Trinity Continuums is the way it is because we needed something to really make Novas super cool. And so our scale goes up to 10. But God tier Scions, gods, demigods, 5. That's it. Your scale can go up to 5. And that's powerful. That is extraordinarily powerful in that game because that is the context of which is being used in.
Right. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, Trinity has a lot of levers and buttons and flips. There's tags and powers and things that connect each other. So we needed a more granular scale because there needed to be a meaningful distinction between 2, 3, and 4 as a random example, right? Whereas with Scion, it's just scale. Any amount of scale out of the gate means you're already superhuman. So that would be kind of like the first 3 or 4 points to Aberrant, extremely roughly equivalent, because it's you're doing mythic stuff out of the gate, bam. So that's kind of more the point. And so going even higher than that, it becomes, oh my God, this is just amazingly huge. So, whereas another interesting point, like for Aberrant, we have negative scale for size, microscopic scale, specifically for Aberrant. And some people have been like, why is this the only one that goes negative? And what it really comes down to is we could have just said it's as scale, but it's for microscopic size. But it's easier to explain if we just use negative numbers, right? Because this is scale for microscopic size. From a mechanical standpoint, that's all it really means. But by saying -4, it's easier to parse in your head. Oh, okay, so it's much smaller because it's a negative number. That's really all it is.
Right. Yeah, so that makes it one of those things where our games are slightly different between each other. And if you play all the games and you see the difference.
Hi, Monica.
Sorry, Monica came into the chat and is defending. Theros was originally a 1E character.
Right, we have to clarify. The 1E character.
Yeah. Yeah, Monica, I am pretty sure you were playing it as its 2E iteration yes. In my Chaos game, which I was talking about earlier.
You showed us the physical sheet.
Yeah. So that's why I said that. But, oh man, I lost what I was talking about. The differences in the games. Yeah, right, so... Yeah. And I do recognize that could be confusing if you do read all of our games. Mm-hmm. That, as Edric says, you can't help but to bring the preconceived notions that you have from one game to another, especially when the systems are so similar, where they're using a similar system. Everything is using Storypath, but this Storypath is a little different here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
And that is something that, I see and I hear you as a thing that could be a source of confusion. Mm-hmm. Like, we hear you on that. So,
and that's I think a good point is we've been talking a lot about implicit rules. Implicit rules are not necessarily bad, but that by the very fact that they're implicit means that people are coming this from different perspectives, and sometimes there's enough nuance distinction between those different perspectives that the implicit rule maybe needs to be made explicit. sometimes those rules are damaging if they're made explicit, and sometimes those rules need to be made explicit in certain circumstances. So, like, I'm thinking about like tournament chess, right? Okay. There's an implicit rule that you will move your chess piece within a reasonable amount of time. You can't just sit and walk away from your chess board for months and never make a move. At a certain point in time, there's the implicit rule of you've abandoned the game and you lose. But that changes in two circumstances. One is in professional chess, you do have a specific time limit to make your move in. And that's to avoid these kinds of manipulations of implicit rules for benefit. But also, that implicit rule can change if you're, say, doing chess by mail. Obviously, you're going to spend months between moves because you're doing it through the mail. It may be a long period of time before someone makes their return move. And I usually have movies where like two people who just show they're really smart, they play chess in their heads, they run into the person they're playing chess with, they'll just name a move and walk away, and because they're so cool and badass. And while it's a weird trope that we slid into culturally, it does demonstrate that these two players have made the implicit rule of we will take as long as we want to with it, and also we don't need to have the board physically present for us to be able to continue our game.
Right.
So all of those are kind of examples of how you can make implicit rules explicit on a case-by-case basis as well as a design perspective. A lot of times when we as designers leave that implicit space open, it's so that people can fill that void with their rules and not have to feel like they are contradicting an established written rules. It goes back to the I don't want to rules as written versus rules as intended kind of argument. It's the rules are written this way, so we should play it that way. It's like, we don't have a rule written down, so you can fill that void with your implicit rules. But sometimes it is valid that people bring expectations from other games in, and if it happens enough to where we see a noteworthy amount of people who are making the assumption and therefore playing the game in a way that is not as we intended it, or a way as desired, then we may, maybe a second edition or a official errata or something comes out. But most of the time, I rarely see that. Like in this case of scale, it's okay, maybe if we ever did new editions of those games, we maybe dial in that scale a little more clearly so that way it's more consistent, because that's a point where it's like, hey, there's no real reason to start 0 versus 1. That's just an error, honestly. But being able to say, okay, we're going to put these books out and then maybe clarifying in side products. Okay, well, this game has changed these exact things, and here's why. But we're getting close on time. I think we've caught all the questions in the chat. But just in case, if you have any last minute questions, we have a couple more minutes. But in the meantime, is there anything else, Danielle, we need to cover on this topic?
Implicit, explicit rules. Yeah, I think we've kind of thoroughly covered and tangented into all sorts of other discussions. So, I was thinking about Blades in the Dark while we were talking about games with lots of rules that are actually kind of simple.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's definitely a game that I look at that, it's definitely in the indie game sphere, and the how you play is so very simple, but it's also a really complicated game, deceptively complicated. Every time I run it, I find myself in like there's a lot of decisions to be made.
Yep.
Of how to do a mission, like what's the mission going to be. That's a game that puts a lot of mental burden onto the players themselves about what they want to do. And there's some implicit rules about who's the one that comes up with the story.
Yeah.
And if you don't realize that the person who's coming up with the story is still the game master, then it can get really hard to run in that game. And really hard to play that game. And Monica's right. Like, Blades in the Dark is not rules light. It is so chock full of rules and so many things to do. And, the first, it is a game that I was really impressed with when I was first looking at it. And I still am. Like, I think it's a fantastic game, and it's a fantastic focused game, and it does what it wants. Like, it does what it is doing very, very well. But the first, I don't know, 2/3 of the book is rules. and then there's a setting in the back. And when I first was reading through Blades in the Dark, because it puts all of the rules up front, I didn't even realize the game had a setting.
Yeah.
Until somebody was like, let's play the game and we're going to use the, and I was like, oh, okay. Well, what setting? And they were like, well, the one in the book. And I was like, there's one in the book?
Yeah.
I hadn't gotten there yet.
Right.
I don't know, like there is a setting. It's actually really cool. Because the book is so, rules forward, that I hadn't gotten to that part of the book yet. I didn't even realize it had this really complex setting along with these really kind of dense rules. And they're not dense in the fact that they're complicated or hard to use. They're just, there's a lot of them.
Yeah. Blades in the Dark for me feels a lot more like something like a collectible card game design, where there are lots of core assumptions and there are lots of exceptions, and the gameplay synergy takes place by finding the interesting space between the exceptions and the core rules, and how that results in things. And the first books, subsequent books I understand have clarified this, but the first time I played the first book was unclear on which were which, and it makes it really hard to get through and to run at the table, because it's not a clear, okay, here are the core rules. Anything, any specific rules that violate these core rules take precedence. Something like that would have, I think, made the whole thing a lot clearer, but it isn't. It's kind of muddied on that front. So this is, but again, it had the implicit rule of, okay, well, most people playing these games inherently understand that, but there's a reason why Magic the Gathering, for example, puts that in all of their rule books, is because that's not necessarily clear. I know the very first versions of Magic the Gathering did not have that rule, and it led to huge conflicts. And eventually it's like, okay, no, here are general rules. If a card violates this rule, then that specific exception takes precedent.
Well, I mean, that's a game that didn't have it, and then suddenly needed a stack rule, right? Like,
oh yeah, first
Magic
in, last
the Gathering.
out,
yeah, first in, last out, and like stacking rule, and it. If you look back at even revised, there are no rules about that in the rule book. But they sure had to start making rules about that because it wasn't clear enough. And it's like, well, if I played this and then they played this and then I played this in response, then does the thing actually happen, or what happens? And there's, the more they added response and reactions to the game, the more they were like, okay, we really need to codify how that works, because without an explicit rule, it's very, it's very muddy of what the implied action should be.
Right.
And that is a thing too, where it's like you assume that people will understand the implication, but if you notice that people are not understanding implications, sometimes it's best to just go ahead and write an explicit rule to make it codified.
Yep, exactly. So that's that. That's our discussion / rant about implicit versus explicit rules. So
what are we talking about next?
I would say we've done 4 of these. We don't have a 5th topic yet. So we're at that kind of slightly awkward stage of we're going to see if we have more thoughts. If we do, then we'll come back in 2 weeks with a 5th episode. If not, then this has been a fun, cool thing to do for a couple of months. If you have things that you would like us to see, feel free to kind of drop them in the Onyx Path Discord, and we'll take those into consideration. But and it might be a case where we take maybe a month off as we think, here's 3 or 4 more topics, then we'll do another season of these or whatever. So we're still mulling that over right now. But it's fine, Travis. I'll just make fun of you later. It's cool. But yeah, other than that, again, I think this has been fun. This has been cool. If nothing else, I've learned a lot more about different teas I should be trying right now. So that's really, really good for me.
Yeah. I have so many teas I haven't drank on the show yet.
I know. Well, that's the whole reason to keep doing this, is just so we can get you through all of those extra teas.
Yes.
So awesome, cool. Then see y'all. Take time, and hopefully we'll see you all later. Take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.